Donc, maintenant, j'aimerais inviter à venir me rejoindre sur la scène Mme Catherine Cobden, qui est présidente et directrice générale de l'Association canadienne des producteurs d'acier. Après votre intervention, Mme Cobden, Dale Bugin, vice-président exécutif de l'Institut climatique du Canada, ainsi que les intervenants du panel suivant pourront nous rejoindre sur scène pour discuter du prochain sujet, améliorer le système de tarification fondé sur le rendement.
Good afternoon, everyone. And once again, I really appreciate the opportunity to address you. I am Catherine Cobden, the President and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association. And I'm also, where are all my fellow board members? I'm also a very proud director of the Canadian Climate Institute. And as you can tell by the quality of the exchange today, there's a lot of reason to be proud to be contributing to this organization's direction. All right, so my task is to introduce the next panel. And the panel title is not there. It is going to be on the output-based pricing system, which of course I'll get into. It is not the thing that has been taking up all the oxygen, if you will, over the last couple of weeks. In fact, this panel will be talking about the other side of the carbon pricing regime, which is, of course, the industrial side of our carbon pricing regime. So I think it's indisputable that there is incredible momentum towards net zero in this country. Of course, net zero is the law of the land, but it's also really taking hold in key sectors of our economy. Our work is clearly an imperative for the planet, but as has been said countless times already today, I really have lost track, it's also an economic imperative. Canadian steel producers and many other sectors are committed to doing our part in this journey, which will continue to be difficult for us, but we need to do it. Steel will be a green building block for the net zero economy, so we need to have the green credentials that go with that. The federal OBPS, output-based pricing system, plays a very important role in our transition, either directly or as a backstop via an existing provincial regulatory regime. It is designed to incentivize and reduce emissions while simultaneously safeguarding the international competitiveness of industry through the recognition of trade exposure within the regulatory frame. So, how's it going so far? I think so far, as currently constructed, our sector would argue that the OBPS has been working. Under the system as it stands today, you will have seen the steel industry has so far commenced over $3 billion worth of projects to remove 6 million tons of CO2 by 2030. And I'm quite pleased to report that the operations of one of those projects, Algoma, will start commissioning their new operation as early as the end of next year. However, the regulatory path forward is not without its challenges and not without its areas of debate. First, let's talk about that trade recognition. For those that consider the recognition of trade and competitiveness as a free pass in the regulation or an unnecessary component of the regulation, I would like to counter with a few facts from our sector. Canadian steel, as it exists today, before we do any further transformation, is already amongst the very greenest in the world. We can be proud of it. However, we are unable to compete in our marketplace today against some of the world's highest carbon-containing steel. This challenge is inhibiting and will inhibit further Canada's ability to construct everything from EVs wind towers, solar panels, hydrogen systems, buildings, and much, much more from greener materials. Our exposure to carbon pricing is a contributing factor to the unlevel playing field. And over time, of course, with the growing carbon price, its contribution to the unlevel playing field will grow. The erosion of trade considerations within the output-based pricing system will lead to further competitiveness challenges at a very time when the industry is taking those first critical steps. And they're not baby steps. I mean, 6 million tons of CO2. So this will be a game of jeopardy should we reduce those protections. And frankly, the indisputable outcome will be carbon leakage. The planet will not gain. Okay, that's concern number one. Concern number two is uncertainty. And this is a big one, and we've been discussing it already through several conversations today. As things stand, there is presently no visibility or certainty of what the post-2030 carbon pricing or regulatory regime, or frankly, policy regime will look like. And of course, we've also talked about political uncertainty that we face related to the OBPS. Thirdly, is the question of the range of potential policies, or that, toolkit, if you will, the suite of policies that will be in place. Some of those are absolutely existential to us. If we don't have them in place, we won't be able to get the job done. So important discussions are expected, not even begun, or in some cases underway, such as reciprocal procurement, border measures, contracts for differences. But to date, they're not concluded. So I hope that gives you a few, at least, areas that are heavily on the minds of heavy industry for the panel to kind of dive into. I do hope they take some of these challenging questions on, and I do recognize that this is not straightforward and up for many more conversations. But I do look forward to what they have to say, and will want to thank, frankly, the CCI. For once again facilitating what I will call those necessary discussions that we just simply must have in order to reach our ambitious goals. If we can't talk to one another and work through these things, we'll never get there. So again, I'd like to thank CCI and NZAB for the opportunity to open this panel, and I'll now turn it to Dale, who can take it from here. Thanks, everyone.
Afternoon, folks. So you're now here for the geekiest of all the panels today on output-based carbon pricing. That's right, I like the cheers. Nerds. So let me introduce my panel here. I'm Dale Bugin. I'm the Executive Vice President at the Climate Institute. I have Sarah Petrovan, the Vice President of Sustainability at the Cement Association. I have Michael Bernstein, the Executive Director at Clean Prosperity, as well as a member of NZAB. And I have Caroline Brett, who is the Executive Director at Climate Action Network Canada. So a very impressive panel. We're here to talk about OBPS, as they call it. To save my panelists a little bit of pain, let me set this up and explain to you bluntly what the hell OBPS is, so that we have a bit of sense to start at the same place. So as Catherine said, this is the carbon pricing system for heavy emitters, for large industry, and especially for industry that is competing in international markets. So I won't go too deep into the weeds, but the basics are this, that there is an emissions intensity threshold for sectors. Firms that do better than that emissions intensity threshold, that they improve their performance such that they are low emitters, can generate credits. They can sell those credits to others in the system. Those that are above the threshold can buy additional credits from their peers on the market, or they can pay that carbon price for the emissions that exceed the threshold. So the gist of all of that is incentive to reduce emissions, because you can always reduce emissions and have one extra credit to sell, but lower costs, and as a result, a better ability to compete in international markets. Maybe we can show the first figure as well, because the final piece of this puzzle is that this isn't one system across the country, this is multiple systems. Provinces are increasingly moving towards implementing their own OBPS systems. And that means there's some variation across the country, even though the common framework and the common system applies in all of them. Okay, so now put on your wonk hats, and I'm going to give you the first poll question. We're not going to come to the results later, but this will set the stage. So I want you to take your best forecast as to what the price of credits will be in 2030 for OBPS systems in Canada. And we know that the price that government will charge for you above the threshold will rise to $170 per ton by 2030. But we also know there's some dynamics in that market that we will come to. So pull out your Slidos and take your best shot at where you think that price will be. You're now all futures traders today. Okay, we'll come back to that in a little bit. But in the meantime, let's get going. So Sarah, I want to start with you. I want to pick up the lead that Catherine gave us. Part of this is about leveling the playing field internationally while maintaining those incentives to reduce emissions. That's your sector too. You guys are an emissions-intensive, trade-exposed sector, competing in markets. Is OBPS working in protecting competitiveness for you?
Yes. Yep. It's a good system. We like it. It recognizes industries that are emissions intensive and trade exposed and treats them accordingly. It's a system that enables us to reduce our emissions and consider performance improvements over time. It's a good system.
Okay, Michael, how about for you? You have written about not just protecting competitiveness of the heavy emitters, but also about firms that are competing for capital to reduce emissions and increasingly competing in an environment that is more complicated because of the US Inflation Reduction Act. From that lens, is OBPS working?
It's not working as well as it should be. And the key reason is really what's referenced in the slide is uncertainty around what the future value of those credits are going to be. In order to unlock decarbonization investments, large-scale, hundreds of millions of dollars, billion-dollar projects, one of the major drivers of those decisions is going to be the value of credits. And this is a particularly acute challenge in the face of the Inflation Reduction Act that we've heard mentioned a number of times today already. They are pouring staggering amounts of money at a variety of decarbonization technologies. And it is going to be very difficult for Canada to match that dollar for dollar. We heard the two ministers talk about that earlier today. But the credits involved in industrial pricing systems can be Canada's at least partial answer to that. It's almost a secret ingredient that we have in order to be competitive in a particular set of sectors. And to illustrate that, let me give you a quick example. Take blue hydrogen, for example. The US Inflation Reduction Act is offering $1.10 Canadian per kilogram of blue hydrogen produced. Now, Canada has said part of our answer to this is the investment tax credits. But when you do the math, you realize those investment tax credits are worth under 10 cents a kilogram. So you're asking investors to take hundreds of millions of dollars of losses by locating in Alberta versus Texas, let's just say. But where we can fill in the gap is with those credits. Because if the credits are actually trading at a value near the headline price, that's about 85 cents, give or take, per kilogram. Now, combined with the investment tax credits, you've closed that gap. And you're allowing Canada to compete and to win, perhaps on other factors, clean electricity, lower energy prices, et cetera. So if we want to be in the ballpark and compete with the US, and we're acknowledging that we can't do this on a dollar-for-dollar basis, I think it's critical that we create certainty in the credit value markets. And that will actually free up the fiscal capacity to potentially address other technologies that aren't governed by OBPS. So in short, I think certainty is critical here. And of course, there's policy tools like contracts for difference that I'm sure we'll talk about later.
We will get that.
Hold on.
But I'll save that for
I know
for
you're
later on.
excited about CCFDs, Michael.
That's true.
Not as excited as I am.
I know.
I
See,
beg
look
to
at
differ.
this is going to be
We'll
a hard
see.
to manage
Yeah, we'll
panel.
see.
They're just too
We'll
into
compete.
this. Okay, Caro, let's go to the third leg of the stool, because this isn't just about competitiveness. This is also about emissions reductions from some of the biggest sources of emissions, these emissions-intensive heavy industry. What do you think on that front? Is this policy tool working? Can it work? What's your reaction there about how OBPS fits into our environmental strategy?
Je pense que c'est la bonne question à poser, en fait. C'est quoi l'objectif d'un outil politique? Et dans le cas des systèmes de prix, ce que Michael nous disait juste maintenant, on cherche l'efficience, c'est-à-dire c'est quoi la façon la moins chère, finalement, de réduire une tonne de gaz à effet de serre. Mais on peut avoir d'autres objectifs de politique publique, puis je pense en particulier après l'été d'impact climatique dévastateur qu'on vient de vivre, c'est important de remettre à l'avant-plan ces objectifs-là. Puis les objectifs que, selon nous, au Réseau Action Climat, on devrait considérer, c'est d'abord et avant tout l'efficacité. Est-ce qu'une mesure réussit à réduire les émissions de gaz à effet de serre? Je pense que quand je regarde l'expansion continue des émissions du secteur pétrolier et gazier, bien entendu, au niveau des processus, on a parlé du ciment, de l'acier, agriculture également, peut-être que le système de prix basé sur le rendement est efficace, mais cet éléphant dans la pièce qui est le secteur des pétroliers et gaziers, je pense, au niveau de l'efficacité, on peut repasser. Et dans un second temps, un objectif important à considérer aussi, c'est celui de l'équité. Je pense qu'on a beaucoup entendu parler au cours des 2 dernières semaines de l'impact de la crise du coût de la vie sur les Canadiennes et Canadiens. Je regardais des données en 2020 qui disaient qu'en moyenne, le prix d'une tonne de gaz à effet de serre à la pompe pour les consommateurs tristes canadiens était de 30 $, alors que Suncor, qui, je le rappelle, génère autant d'émissions annuelles que la Tunisie, paie en moyenne, pour la même année, en 2020, 2,10 $ la tonne. Donc, au niveau de l'équité, également, je ne pense pas nécessairement que ce système de prix atteint l'objectif non plus.
Thank you. Okay, so let's open it up to all three of you, because in a way, all of what you're talking about, to some extent, circles around those emissions intensity thresholds. How much support you're giving to firms, how much you're charging them for how much of their emissions. Balancing those three priorities is the art there. So react to that. Are we at the right level of emissions intensities? Are we at the right level of stringency, as they say, in these OBPS systems?
It's a...
Yeah, I'll go to you first, Sarah.
So it's always a careful dance, right? And let's remember, like, the objective is to reduce our emissions over time. And so everybody recognizes that stringency has to occur, that the benchmarks have to come down. But at the same time, we have to remember, particularly in my sector, as is true in other sectors, we are competing against jurisdictions that are operating not under a carbon price. And so if you displace cement produced in Canada with cement produced in another jurisdiction, let's remember, we're not reducing emissions, we're just offshoring them. And so it is a fine balance between tightening the benchmarks in line with solutions that are actually available, that can be deployed, and what those are different in different provinces in the country. And then at the same time, making sure that the market is also ready for what you can produce, because obviously we produce the end product, which is concrete. It's technologically possible to produce a net zero concrete today, but based on code standards, specifications, et cetera, you're not allowed to use it in a construction project, of which you could see a couple of them when you look out the window. And so it's important that you look at carbon pricing in the suite of industrial decarbonization as a set of policy tools that need to get us to a certain point, but that you have to design that carbon pricing to not create perversion in the marketplace that takes away your economic competitiveness and creates job loss and offshores your emissions.
So Sarah, you didn't answer the question. Should the thresholds go down? Should they be tightened?
I have no problem with tightening thresholds. Of course they should be tightened, but they also have to be tightened in line with reality, and other policies need to move forward as we ratchet the carbon price down.
Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I think we need to do three things. I think we need to tighten benchmarks, absolutely, as a general statement. I think we need to be looking sector by sector for areas where there may need to be a relaxation of that tightening rate, and Sarah's kind of referring to that. And I think we also need to be thinking about complementary policy that protects competitiveness, things like border carbon adjustments, right? So to unpack that just a little bit, I mean, the reason why I think we need to be raising or tightening, let's say, the benchmarks in general is because right now we actually have a system that is not consistent with the emissions reductions goals that have been set out by the federal government. So if you look at a system like Alberta's, which is the largest industrial pricing system in the country by far, 55% of our emissions, or industrial emissions rather, what you see there is that the rules by 2030 are going to place about 45, maybe 50 megatons at most under a so-called compliance obligation, meaning they have to pay a carbon price or buy credits. Well, if you then ask the question, how many emissions reductions do those facilities actually have to undertake by 2030 in order to do their fair share of our ERP, our 2030 emissions goal, it's about 70 megatons. So how can we have a system that's only charging a carbon price on about 50 or south of 50 megatons when we're expecting 70 megatons of reductions? If we want to fully leverage this system, which is the most cost-effective approach to getting those reductions, we ought to be tightening the system. And now that does not mean, as I see Sarah getting excited here, that we can't look at specific circumstances by sector and look at other accommodations for sectors that are particularly acutely affected. But I think the number of sectors that fall on that list is smaller than one might expect at first. And of course, another answer to that over time, hopefully sooner than later, is addressing the competitiveness challenge through a border carbon adjustment. And that's some work that actually, Dale, you and I are involved in as part of this Carbon Competitiveness Commission. But that's essentially what I think we need to do here.
Hot pursuit from Sarah before I go to Carol.
So just my question on that is that, but that's only true if you're expecting the carbon price to do all of the emissions reductions, right? Are we not also talking about potentially the role of complementary policies? Like, I'm not saying that you couldn't, but then you have to make the deliberate policy decision to say that we're getting those 70-ish plus megatons solely from the carbon price.
Well, I wouldn't say it would be solely from the carbon price, but I think if we're interested in low-cost policy, why wouldn't we drive as many emissions reductions as we can through industrial pricing? You know, in some cases, that is still going to need to be matched with other complementary policies, whether it's investment tax credits, maybe regulations in some cases. But my own view would be let's generate as many emissions reductions as we can from our lowest cost policy tool.
We could debate whether or not it's a low-cost
policy. Let's go to Carol. Do you agree with Michael, given that your points about fairness and costs, but also about emissions reductions?
J'étais d'accord avec Michael jusqu'à un certain point, jusqu'à ce que l'objectif de réduire les tonnes au moindre coût soit mis de l'avant, comme je le disais tantôt. Puis je pense que c'est important de revenir à la question de pourquoi c'est pas efficace. Puis, bon, plusieurs économistes sur scène, j'ai été formée comme économiste, donc je peux me permettre de faire un petit dig aux économistes. Le problème, c'est que la politique existe. Donc, même si, en théorie, on voudrait avoir un prix constant à travers l'économie, bien, les différents secteurs, finalement, et aussi de façon régionale, on voit, viennent lobbyer pour creuser, finalement, des exemptions, des allocations gratuites qui, finalement, ne reflètent plus cette question-là de la tonne la moins chère, si on prenait ça comme objectif. Par contre, sur la question des mesures complémentaires, I agree with Sarah, and I'm going to say this in English because I'm not sure how to say it in French. I was on the train this morning on my way here rereading Danny Cullenward's book, Making Climate Policy Work, which looks at carbon pricing mechanisms across the world. And what Danny and his co-author David Victor find is that often carbon markets can be called Potemkin markets, right? They are kind of a facade. They exist, but they're not doing the heavy lifting of emissions reductions. Other policies are. And so I think the question we need to ask ourselves in Canada is across those sectors, do we have these complementary measures that are allowing to do the heavy lifting, and then the carbon pricing will kind of take care of the residual, but they won't be doing the heavy lifting, especially if we want to meet this crisis at the speed and scale that it requires.
Thank you for all of that, all your very insightful comments. Let's go to our poll and throw up the results of the Slido poll, if we could. So to me, this is really interesting, that what you're essentially seeing is a distribution of possible prices in 2030. Now imagine you're an investor. Imagine you're an investor trying to make a bet based on these carbon prices. Maybe you don't know, maybe you have a sense it's going to be between 50 and 170 likely, but it might not be, and it might be. Who knows? Lots of you, a quarter of you have said that, actually there isn't an answer for none of the above. But there's lots of uncertainty here as to what that price is going to be that makes it hard to place those investment bets. So, panel, what does that mean? What does that mean for how we design OBPS? What does it mean for what else we do? How do we tackle this real significant problem that lots of you have flagged about uncertainty? And I'll take this chance to remind you to put other questions into the Slido too, please.
So
who wants in first?
Let me go first, and then Michael, we can duke it out. Okay. So I'm from industry. What do we want? Certainty. When do we want it? Now. So if you're going to take the bet on building a near or net zero capital project, right? We're not talking about couch cushion change here. We're talking about in the billions of dollars. So, the number 1.4 billion has been thrown around publicly for the Edmonton CCS project. That will be the world's first full-scale capture, maybe, if we can move fast. The US is certainly catching up, but maybe the world's first full-scale capture at a cement plant will be the world's first net zero cement without the use of offsets. So that project's $1.4 billion. And that's just on the CapEx side, right? There's the ongoing OpEx expenditure of transporting and storing carbon. And so how do you build a business case around a project like that, especially given the fact that the market is not willing to bear any sort of premium around net zero cement? Well, you sell credits. And that's just a simple math equation. To make a business case, you need a credit at a value of X. And if you can get the value of X on the market, then you have a business case and you can go ahead and you can build a net zero project. If you can't get that value on the marketplace, then you do not have a business case. And, we are all here to solve the challenge of climate change, absolutely, but business is business, and business needs to make money in order to make investments. And so, therefore, drum roll please, you need a guarantee on the value of the carbon credit. And one of the ways that you can provide that guarantee is on a fun little policy called carbon contracts for difference. Take it away, Bernstein.
I thought we were going to duke it out.
We will, don't worry, and I will be right.
It's actually a tag team.
That's how that's going to go.
Carry on.
Yeah, well, look, I think imagine if you were one of those industrial participants, and you tried to get financing for that project, and you said, we don't know what the credit values are going to be in 2030. And even worse than that, that financier might have the opportunity to invest in a project in the United States where there is clarity, there is certainty on what the incentives are, at least the baseline incentives. So yeah, absolutely. We think that a carbon contract for difference is an essential component of having Canada realize the full potential of its output-based pricing system and also capitalize on the economic opportunity that's in front of us. And so what's really important for us about that contract for difference is that it has to be against the credit values, as Sarah said. Because just to reinforce the point, even if you're in a world where the carbon price today was $170, if firms can purchase credits for $20, $30, $40, that $170 price is not particularly meaningful. No one is going to pay it if they have the opportunity to buy credits. So it's essential that that contract be against credit values. It's essential in our view, or let me put it differently, it's highly preferable that those contracts are offered on an off-the-shelf way. In other words, that investors understand upfront what is the value they're going to get from a contract. Because if we design these programs where industrial proponents are going to have to go through months and months of negotiation, spend money and time without clarity on what the result is going to be in the end, we're going to run into challenges. We're going to do the same thing it's going to be the same kind of characteristics we have of our existing bespoke programs. So I think what's most critical is seeing an off-the-counter, credit value-based contract for difference. There are other features we can get into, but to me, those are the most essential.
I think we're not going to get into it.
I was going to say, I don't agree with him, but
if you guys want to talk OBPS, you can do so with Sarah and Michael and me offline. Let's keep it going. Caro, I know you wanted to talk about one other question, then we'll get to the audience questions. Talk to me about interactions with other policies, because this isn't all by itself. This is one part of a broader package of policies. What's important to think about when we're thinking about how OBPS intersects or not with other policies?
Il y a toute une suite de réglementations qui sont en développement, puis je pense que pas mal tout le monde dans la salle ici les suit de très près. Quand on regarde les secteurs qui sont visés par le système de prix basé sur le rendement, comme je le disais tantôt, il y a un gros éléphant dans la pièce et ce sont les émissions du secteur pétrolier et gazier. On a entendu le ministre Guilbeault tantôt répéter qu'un cadre s'en venait sur la question du plafonnement des émissions du secteur pétrolier et gazier. Je pense que c'est très clair qu'en ce moment, sous sa forme actuelle, le système de prix basé sur le rendement est tout à fait insuffisant et inefficace à réduire les émissions de ce secteur. Et ça nous prend un plafond qui est rigoureux, qui est ambitieux et qui a le moins possible de flexibilité dans les mécanismes de compliance. Je m'excuse, je travaille plus en anglais qu'en français, donc c'est un peu difficile. Mais voilà, donc je pense que le plafonnement des émissions du secteur pétrolier-gazier est très important. On a parlé aussi du Inflation Reduction Act aux États-Unis, donc l'important d'avoir des politiques industrielles qui complémentent les signaux de prix qui sont envoyés par le système. Et voilà.
Anybody else want in on interactions?
Yeah, can I add maybe one or two quick points here? Certainly policy interaction comes with the risk of undermining the incentive presented by the output-based pricing systems. Because if you have, what you could end up with is an oversupply of credits in the market, which will push credit prices down and require raising stringency and tightening the rules, essentially, in order to fix that challenge. And one of the things that it makes me think of is it's not just federal policy, right? Provincial policy can do this too. There's also uncertainty about the rate of cost decline of technologies. So I think all of that points to a need to think about the way we set the rules on these output-based pricing systems differently to allow us to be more dynamic than the 5-year phases that we are currently operating under. And there's more adaptive ways in which you can have predictable rules, but to have those rules based on the actual circumstances in the market over, for example, the previous 12 months. And so I hope we start to consider that as part of the way we set the rules in these systems.
And I don't disagree with anything that my co-panelists are saying. I just maybe feel about it differently, right? Nobody loves pancaking regulations that all fight with each other to do pretty much the same thing. Yep. And I think likewise, there's also the challenge of some of these regulations having unintended consequences, right? Like potentially limiting, your emissions reductions, things that you're being driven to do by the OBPS, for example, might actually be limited or disallowed in some obscure calculation in some other regulatory policy. And so, I agree with the necessity for understanding appropriate policy interaction, but maybe for slightly different reasons.
Yeah, streamlined policy, I'm all for that. We can use the OBPS for a lot more than we currently are.
So the audience is on the same page here. They're also asking about interaction in a different way, because one of the questions here is, as the electricity sector is not trade exposed, why is it still under OBPS? And it's one of the easier sectors to decarbonize. I can take that one step further into our interaction conversation, because electricity is also covered by the Clean Electricity Regulation, and so that's an explicit area of overlap. So if anybody wants, react to the question, react to electricity and OBPS.
Est-ce que je peux réagir avant juste à l'échange entre Sarah et Michael sur la question du chevauchement des différentes politiques? Je pense que c'est important de regarder comment on réduit les émissions à court terme et à long terme. À l'Institut canadien sur le climat, vous avez fait un travail, là je m'excuse encore, je vais le dire en anglais, les safe bets et les paris qui sont plus risqués en matière d'investissement climatique. Quand on regarde la trajectoire, comment on se rend à la carboneutralité en 2050, la question, c'est pas juste la cible à la fin, mais c'est aussi le chemin qu'on prend pour s'y rendre. Et des systèmes de prix, finalement, nous disent on va graduellement réduire nos émissions, mais ça ne prend pas en considération les transformations systémiques plus grandes que notre économie, que notre société doit opérer pour atteindre l'objectif. Je pense à la sortie des énergies fossiles. Je sais que c'est un petit peu un tabou dans cette salle, surtout dans un contexte où on doit considérer la juridiction du fédéral, mais reste que on a des données qui sont sorties hier sur l'écart de production de pétrole et de gaz et ce qu'on doit faire pour limiter le réchauffement climatique à 1,5 degrés Celsius. Et force est d'admettre que le Canada n'est pas sur le bon chemin. Donc, je pense qu'il y a une réflexion qu'on doit faire en tant que société, à travers l'économie, finalement, de comment est-ce qu'on s'assure qu'on a davantage que des signaux de prix qui nous permettent de faire cette transition de façon à ce que l'économie se diversifie et bénéficie au complet.
Okay, we're almost to the end here, so I know there are other great questions from the audience, but instead, I think I want to give the panel a chance for final thoughts here to close this down. So you have 30 seconds or so each. What's the big takeaway for OBPS for Canada, and what's the number one priority for improving it moving forward? Let's go opposite order. Carol, why don't you go first?
It's not enough. We need more complementary policy.
Well, I think we need complementary policy. I would specifically point, and this may not be what you're referring to, but I would specifically point to competitiveness measures like the border carbon adjustments, like thinking about how also we're going to create more integration across provincial systems to perhaps allow trading across jurisdictions. But as you could probably predict from me, I mean, the most important policy for me is pretty obvious. I think it's, without question, and above all, carbon contracts for difference, because I just don't see how we make the system work the way we want without that policy.
Sarah, you get the last word.
Okay, what do we want? Certainty. When do we want it? Now. So certainty of the headline carbon price trajectory past 2030, like we know right now the plan is for it to remain static, but what's going to happen? Certainty of market interaction. What is the credit price going to be? How is that going to operate within the different pricing systems in the country? Are we moving towards market fungibility where you can trade credits within different systems? That sort of certainty is what creates investment. Investment is what is going to help us decarbonize. The end.
That's a good ending. Thanks very much to my great panelists. The great conversation. I'll thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.